Well, hello everybody. Welcome back. We kind of missed you. Going over to once a month, although it's a lot easier to handle, we sort of go off the boil a bit, don't we? But here we are again, and we have three excellent speakers today, and two of whom are new, Peter and Caroline, so be nice to them. Steve, we've seen before, so you don't have to be nice to him. Our next meeting is a special on the 27th of November, so that is in 2 weeks' time. And it's Sam Richards talking about a particular interest of his, which is music education. You'll have had the emails, but please do come to that if you're interested in what Sam's got to say, music education and the idea of learning by ear and oral and written and that sort of stuff. So that's the 27th, same time, same place, but in a fortnight's time. And then our next regular meeting, excuse me, which will actually be the 50th, hurrah. And that will be our Christmas special. And as you know, this is much anticipated, our Christmas booze. And we know, all we know so far is that Stephen Miller will give us is going to give us a talk about a Christmas custom, and the rest of it we'll play it by ear. But anyway, so without further ado, I always forget to say that if you don't want to be recorded and on YouTube forever, turn your camera off.
Steve, what is the date for the Christmas special?
Oh, didn't I say? No, I didn't. 11th of December. Slightly early Christmas, but after that we're all too busy. So back to today's. We're going to start with Caroline Macafee, talking about Scottish singers. And where are you? You're there, Caroline. Would you like to unmute and take it over?
Okay. So, am I on?
We can't see it yet. We can hear you, but we can't see your shared screen. That's happening. That's it. Yes, you need to start the slideshow and then you're ready. That's it.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk about my new book, Scots Folk Singers and Their Sources, a study of two major Scottish song collections. As the title says, it's about singers, but it's not about specific singers. It's in the nature of a demographic study, and it takes a very broad sweep, looking at the population of contributors in two collections. One is the Greig-Duncan folk song collection, gathered by Gavin Greig and the Reverend James Duncan in the northeast of Scotland, mainly between 1902 and 1911, and edited in 8 volumes by Patrick Schuldham-Shaw, Emily Lyle, and others. The second data set consists of non-Gaelic song contributors in the School of Scottish Studies archives. I looked at these two sets of singers in terms of male versus female, whether they're travellers or members of the general population, the decade of their birth, how old they were when recorded, and so on. Some of the same questions can be asked about the population from which songs were learned, and this is obviously a more shadowy body of people receding into the distance, but they do take us excitingly far into the distance, well into the 18th century in Greig-Duncan. Where there is information about how a song was learned, in both collections, this self-reported song transmission was mainly person to person, since that was the song culture that the collectors wanted to tap into. I look at the numbers of contributors who learned songs from people within the family and outside the family, and what the family relationships were, including, of course, intergenerational relationships, and also the distinction between the extended and the nuclear family. Some of you listening will be familiar with the Tober and Dulcich project, which has digitised and made public many of the school's recordings. A much larger database sits behind the selection of material that's online. Even so, it doesn't give a complete picture of the school's collection, as the main phase of the digitisation ran out of money and time, as these things do. But there is very good coverage from the 1950s to the 1970s, and I've extracted anonymised data on 1,159 contributors of songs in Scots or English, and also 478 from Greig-Duncan. These are good numbers. These are numbers you can play with, even if the data won't bear the weight of statistical analysis. I mean, this isn't any kind of sample. You can do things with numbers like these. You may be surprised at the predominance of general population males in the data from the school's archives, given the usual focus of discussion on the travellers. The general population males are very nearly half of the contributors in the data that I've extracted, the other three groups being the general population females and the travellers male and female. This isn't just an artifact of the willingness or availability of the general population males to be recorded. In this bar graph, you can see that they are by far their own largest source. And here, in relation to the other groups as well, they're also by far the main source group for everybody except the female travellers. I'll return to that anomaly later. And I think this confirms that they were the most prominent category of singers outside of the family circle. When recordings were made of notable singers, there were often other people present, and the field workers would always try to get everybody to sing in case there were shy talents amongst the company. Hamish Henderson prided himself on being able to get anybody to sing. There was one old lady that he managed to persuade to join in a little with her son, and Hamish can be heard teasing her that he has her on tape. Many of the people caught on tape in this way were not singers with a capital S, as Ewan MacColl would have said. They are, as it were, the bycatch of the school's song fishing expeditions. Nevertheless, their contributions have been assiduously collected, preserved, catalogued, and the aim of my study was to find ways to utilise this material. Since the bycatch were often family members of the more notable singers, it's possible to make rough estimates of some of their dates of birth if these are not known. I spend some time in the book establishing that these estimates are reliable. Adding them in doesn't fundamentally change the patterns that are seen when the known dates alone are used. You might ask, why bother with them then? But they do smooth out the graphs, getting rid of some of the random wobble that you get when numbers are too low. The great thing about working with group figures rather than individual ones is that you could be wrong about every single individual, and as long as you're not wildly out, the group figures will still be about right. The estimate for this person's age is too low, but the estimate for this other person's age is too high, and the errors cancel each other out. I'm confident that the sharper images with the addition of the estimated dates are reliable, but to head off your perfectly reasonable objections, I'll sometimes show both in what follows. So, having gathered up every fragment of information I could from the Tobin-Dolkish database and also from published and online sources and analysed the results, I think I can say that it does give a very detailed and nuanced picture of what was in the ocean, along with the big fish who were specifically sought out. At the same time, to continue with the fishing metaphor, we only see what came up in the nets, and we've no way of measuring how representative this was of the song culture of the time, whether Greig-Duncan's time or the heyday of collecting by the school. Some of my findings confirm things that were already well known. For instance, the strong association of the travellers, especially the women travellers, with child ballads and with family song transmission. But the study also reveals patterns that are not, as it were, visible to the naked eye. And we'll now take a quick look at some of these. There are certain birth decades that stand out as inflection points in the history of the folk song culture. The cohort born in the 1840s was singled out by Cecil Sharp as the last generation he thought it worth collecting from in Somerset. And this cohort is also very prominent amongst the Greig-Duncan contributors. Another similarity with Sharp is the quite substantial number of prosperous farmers and tradesmen and a few clergymen, as seen in this table from Behrman's analysis of Sharp's contributors. This is just the men from Behrman's data. The women are similar in terms of their fathers' or husbands' occupations. A certain amount of information of this kind can be retrieved from the Greig-Duncan collection, thanks to biographical research by the editors. And again, farmers, tradesmen, and professional men and their female relatives are not lacking. This cross-class participation was no doubt important for the vitality of the local culture. Perhaps the most important role of the well-to-do was to provide the spaces and host the occasions for social singing and music making to take place, such as the harvest home, called in Scotland the Kirn, or in the northeast the Meal and Ale. That by the end of the 19th century, the rural entertainments that might be attended by all classes were typically concerts in village halls with platform performances, as Greig himself observed. In the School of Scottish Studies data, what stands out is the 1920s birth cohort. The numbers hit a low point around this time, mainly in the general population, but also to some extent amongst the travellers, before recovering with the folk song revival. There could be various explanations, but the obvious one is that the 1920s cohort were the first to grow up with broadcast music. As such, they appear to represent the transition between the pervasive, communally dispersed folk tradition and the folk revival, whose participants had to make a conscious choice of folk music amongst the various musical subcultural identities now presented to young people. Something else that changes with the revival is that there are now plenty of young women being recorded, whereas there's a tendency for the women born in earlier decades to be a bit older by the time they're willing to sing for the tape recorder. And this brings me to my next topic, the reticence of women singers. There are a few passing hints in the literature of an etiquette of modesty that inhibited young women from singing in front of men outside of the family circle. Returning to these bar graphs that I showed you before, traveller women appear to have been even more constrained by this than the general population. They differ from everybody else in not having the general population men as the main group that they interacted with as a source of songs. And even male travellers are a less important source for them than general population females are. Remember, this is outside of the family. Another hint is that female travellers are likewise the smallest source for male travellers outside of the family. Now, you wouldn't guess this reluctance of female travellers to sing in public from the success of the school field workers in recording them. I would speculate that the recording sessions with them were more family oriented, and in the case of Hamish, he gained the status of a family friend. There is something of a paradox in the role of young women as sources of songs. Until the mid-20th century, it was mainly young, unmarried women who went to work outside the home. and thus came into close contact with men to whom they were not related, but at the same time, they were inhibited from singing in front of them. There is an exception, however, and that is domestic work. We tend not to appreciate what a large proportion of the population was in service in the past, including servants in quite modest households in the days when large numbers of children were the norm. This is not an original observation. I owe it to Peter Laslett's book, The World We Have Lost. If we consult these Scottish census figures, in 1891, nearly 12% of the female population aged 10 and upwards was employed in domestic occupations. It's a bit odd that the census used 10 and upwards as a basis for the figures. By 1891, children in Scotland were supposed to be in full-time education until the age of 14. However, it was possible to obtain an exemption if the child had reached a certain educational level. Mrs. Lyle, one of the Greig-Duncan contributors, was looking after cattle at the age of 10 in about 1879, when the leaving age was still in principle 13. Average family size plummets after the 1872 Education Act, and this demographic transition, as it's called, with the whole complex of social and cultural changes that accompany it, separates the holdout travellers from the rest of the population, at least for a generation or two, until modernity catches up with them too. But that's another story, which I talk about in the book, but I won't try to go into now. Returning to the topic of female domestics, in Greig-Duncan, there are quite a few young women, young female servants from whom men learn songs, and they find their equivalent in the school collection in young women farm servants. I have the impression from Willie Matheson's account of his sources in particular, that women in farm service were in a domestic relationship with the male farm workers and were thus able to go about the farm singing without feeling inhibited. So I suspect that it's the domestic context rather than just the family context that counts, though there isn't enough information to do more with this than note it as a complication to a categorization, family versus non-family, that in general works very well as a basis for analysis. Because of the importance attached to the child ballads and the way this led the school to focus disproportionately on the travellers, I looked separately at the contributors of these ballads and their sources. This audience will be familiar with the work of Francis James Child and his catalogue of long narrative ballads. It has long been recognised that the big ballads were traditionally associated more with women singers. This is largely borne out in the Greig-Duncan data, and the travellers follow a similar pattern. With regard to the general population, however, the association between women singers and the child ballads is a thing of the past by the time the school was recording in the 1950s, if we leave aside the folk revival singers. We can get a lot of time depth by combining data from Greig-Duncan and the school, taking just the general population, that is omitting the travellers and also omitting the later folk revival singers. By the 1900s birth cohort, the percentage of ballad contributors who are female falls considerably below half. A similar graph for child ballad sources declines steadily from very high female values between the 1780s and 1810s to, again, well below 50% by the 1900s. That is, people born in that decade. I realise that the collections are not really comparable in many ways, and the validity of combining them can be questioned, but I'll leave it to somebody else to maybe try it with just the northeastern contributors from the school archives, and eventually somebody should also take in the James Madison Carpenter collection. We have to be careful not to lean too heavily on these results, but there is pretty clearly a falling away of the female predominance in ballad singing and transmission in the general population, even if these percentages and dates might be deceptively precise. These are just a few of the areas explored in the book. The only review I've seen so far is a short notice in a journal of Scottish literature, and the reviewer says that it has little in common with traditional scholarship on ballad sources and singers. I don't think that was meant as either criticism or praise, but just as a statement of fact. What I would say is that scholars in this field, the actual experts on folk song, which I am not, tend to focus on specifics. I come to this from a background that includes quantitative work in sociolinguistics. I have, as it were, weighed the catch rather than counting the individual fish. It's a different perspective and I hope a useful one. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Caroline. That was absolutely fascinating. And I must say, as somebody who's scared, well, I'm not scared of statistics. I don't always understand them, but I have read your book and it was fascinating and the statistics didn't get in the way at all. It was, I learned a hell of a lot. I thought it really good. So I do recommend it. Steve Woodbury, you have a question or a comment?
I don't know these collections, but did you find a difference in the number of female singers depending on male or female collectors?
I didn't look at that.
Do we know in general whether the School of Scottish Studies, for instance, had more male or female collectors? Do you get an impression of that?
There was one prominent female collector, Aileen Monroe, but I don't know that song was her main interest. And otherwise, I think the collectors who started off were mainly male, Hamish Henderson, Alan Bruford, and then later there were a lot of people who collected, sometimes in quite a small way. There were research students, there were visiting collectors. It would be possible to make that kind of inquiry. It would cut down the numbers, and you need to have big enough numbers to see patterns, but it would be worth looking at. I think maybe the nature of the gathering had a lot to do with it, as well as I hinted with the travellers. You tended to get a big group of people who often included family members, and it just seems to have been a lot more convivial. With members of the general population, it's often just a husband and wife who are being recorded, sometimes with friends invited in to join them.
Caroline, do you think that, especially with the School of Scottish Studies collecting, a lot of what we think of as the sort of big singers, you know, the Jeannie Robertsons and Belle Stewart, you know, the Stewart's family and the Robertson family, and they were known for their big ballads.
Yes.
So they were sought out because they sold big ballads. Does that skew the data towards females or towards child ballads?
The data are definitely skewed by having a lot of material from certain individual singers, and for that reason I try to come at the data from several different directions, so that I can see when there's a skew and point that out. There's not a lot of heavy statistics in it, but as I say, because I come at it from a lot of different directions, there is a lot of counting, and but I've tried to present it so that you can skip the data and just read the discussion and the conclusions if you want to.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I can certainly see that we need this kind of analysis for English collections. Like, Sharp is the one that will be crying out for it. Although I don't know if he recorded the kind of information that you need. I suppose genealogical research could tell us the age of the singers, but we very rarely know where they got their songs from, as it were, who they learned them from. And I think that's
Can't go back and ask questions that weren't asked at the time. One of the things I would very much like to know is whether people learned their songs in childhood, because it's mentioned quite often, but not as a regular thing. So it's very difficult to extract reliable data, since there's a small number of people who mention it and others hint at it. That I think probably more could be made of that if somebody was willing to listen. I just, for the most part, used the written summaries of the tape of the tracks through Tobin and Dulhus. I think to get that data on when people learned their songs, it would take a lot of listening. And for farm workers, they very often say they learned a song at a certain place. You need to know their biography to know that, they were at that place when they were 14 and they were at a different place when they were 18 or whatever.
Yeah, a lot more to do, but thank you for that. That was really, I found that really fascinating. And certainly we've got a lot of work to do before we understand all this stuff. So thank you, Caroline. We're going to move on to Peter Barron. Going to talk about carols.
All right.
Yes, over to you, Peter.
Okay, thanks for that, Steve. Let me just share the screen.
Right, we're there.
Oh,
yeah, that's good.
Should have come in at the beginning, but didn't. Never mind. Right. Okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
That's all right. So I've been singing with the carol singers in a place called Upper Denby, and before that Ingbertsworth for over 30 years, a well-known carol singing pub in Yorkshire. And back in the late 80s, early 90s, I thought there must be something on the Lancashire side, because that's where I actually live, of the Pennines. So I sent off various letters to newspapers, and I did get some responses. Nothing like, I couldn't find anything like the Yorkshire tradition. Individual churches having individual carols. There were some teachers who'd kept the local carols going in their schools, so everyone who'd grown up through that school would know, for instance, the West Orton carol. But what I did find was a carol singing tradition. So it's not traditional songs, but this is it's a tradition. It's a carol singing tradition, and it took place in Roby Mill. Now I'm just showing where this is. For those of you outside the country who don't know where Lancashire is, northwest of England, and within Lancashire, and I suppose you might have the words cut off here, depending where you've got your videos. But place called Wigan, used to be in Lancashire, these days in Greater Manchester, and off to the west of that, a place called Roby Mill, and another place called Digmore that I'll also talk about. Roby Mill's still a rural area, although the people who live there very much commute about. Digmore has got completely subsumed by Skelmersdale Newtown. He was referred to as Skem. But if we go back to the 1920s, you can see that both Roby Mill and Digmore were very much rural areas. And I got this lovely letter from a lady called Eunice Halliwell who lived in Roby Mill, and she'd lived in the same house there. She was born there. In fact, the house was built as part of the Homes Fit for Heroes. It's just a small bungalow. And she got some quite interesting bits of music that she'd pricked out, her term pricked out, over the years, including, for instance, a tune for Mailin Bridge, or Anne, which is for the tune Hark the Herald Angels, which anyone who sings in Yorkshire will know that as a standard tune for it. But she knew the tune as being as Beautiful Zion, which is the name for it when we use it, when we sing it up at Denby, because we sing a verse of the children's hymn Beautiful Zion at the end. But Eunice didn't know that, she just knew the name of the tune as being Beautiful Zion. So what she really wanted to tell me about anyway was the carol singing tradition that used to go on New Year's Eve. And of course lots of places used to sing through the night on Christmas Eve, but so I think singing through the night on New Year's Eve is perhaps somewhat less common. And this is a picture of the Primitive Methodist Church in Roby Mill, and the date plate on the end 1860, but they did actually meet in a previous, in the rooms of a previous building on the same site, I believe, for about 16 years before that. So it's unlikely that the tradition of carol singing through the night actually predates the mid-1800s. Anyway, so Eunice took me to see one of the old singers who lived very near her. It was her cousin, Donald. And he gave me quite a lot of information, and then I followed it up with more letters to the newspapers trying to get specific information if anyone knew any more about it. And that turned up a couple more of the singers who used to sing with them, one of whom had actually sung before the Second World War. And the stories they told me were all pretty much in agreement. Obviously customs change over the times, even change year to year, but the basics stayed the same. The carol singers they'd go out throughout the night, finishing about 7 or 8 in the morning, and they'd visit about 50 houses during that time. And they carried on doing it till 1974, when they basically ran out of people to do it. And all the singers were men. And then after a short time, a rest in the morning, they would then go on to the chapel's New Year's tea in the afternoon and sing again. And in later years, some of the singers had moved away from the area, and they'd travel back just to sing through the night on New Year's Eve. And I mentioned Digmore earlier. At the same time as the Roby Mill singers were going out, there was another group, a mixed group, going out from Digmore Methodist Church, but they only sang till 2 or 3 in the morning, and the Roby Mill singers were quite dismissive of them because they didn't do it properly and sing throughout the night. And in some years, this is what we get a connection here with Derbyshire traditions. In some years, I think this is after the Second World War, because they'd go to a watch night service first, and before they set off, they would sing "Before Jehovah's Awful Throne" to the tune that they called Prestwich. But in Fulo, they sing "While Shepherds Watch" to the same tune, but they call it Conquest. And Ian Russell, who is with us, I'm sure we'll have some things to say at the end. He said in Lytton, which is just down the road from Fulo in Derbyshire, at Christmas they used to sing "Before Jehovah's Awful Throne." So it seems a highly unlikely seasonal song, but there we are. They're singing it in Derbyshire and in Roby Mill. In fact, the tune's actually called Deemster, and was written in 1852 by William Owen, a slate quarryman from Prisgall near Carnarvon. Anyway, so having sung Prestwich outside the chapel, they used to visit about 50 houses, finishing with a breakfast about 8 in the morning. And they only actually sang 3 hymns and a New Year's song called "Come Welcome the New Year." And the 3 hymns were "Praise Ye the Lord," "Come Let Us Join Our Cheerful Songs," and "A Charge to Keep I Have." And that gave them a hymn in 3 different metres: long metre, common metre and short metre, so they could sing lots and lots of different tunes, which is what the whole thing seemed to be about, singing tunes. They sing them throughout the night, but only have to remember 3 sets of words. And they did also do some requests. One house apparently always requested Lead Kindly Light. And there were some of the tunes were composed locally. There's one called Standish, which Standish is a place just north of Wigan. And one called Harvey House, which is a house just near Roby Mill. And then the New Year's carol, Come Welcome the New Year, appears in Ian Russell's Sheffield Book of Village Carols as being from Worrell and being sung by both the Big Set and the Bradfield Choral Society. It's got a round number 22276. Well, here's the version from Roby Mill that I was given. I was given more than one copy of that. And then I've got a printed copy which was given to me by the people at Digmore. And the tune was also collected by William G. Everett in Staffordshire from an unknown patient at St Matthew's Hospital, Burntwood. I'm not sure when he collected the tune, but his manuscripts were donated to the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library in the 1950s, and he died in 1957. So that's his transcription of it. There's an error in there. There's either the person who sang it missed a bar out, or the transcription missed a bar out. Other than that, it's just the same. So, as is the case with a number of the Yorkshire, Derbyshire carols, when you actually get down to the bottom of it, it actually comes from the USA. It was written by Robert Lowry published in 1860 for the first time in the children's choir, and he's probably better known for his hymn "Shall We Gather at the River." And he did do a tour of Europe in the 1880s, so it's possible he brought the song across with him then, or it could be there were the Moody and Sankey movements in the 1870s and 1880s. So this is the version from 1871, actually, pure gold for the Sunday school. And I haven't got a recording of this, but apart from a quartet I used to sing with, so I will just do that so you've got some idea of what the song goes like. It's just one verse and a chorus I've done.
Come welcome the new year with anthems of joy, in hymns of thanksgiving our voices employ, and mingle our tributes of gratitude here to him who has blessed us with a happy new year. Happy New Year to you, Happy New Year to you, dear friends and companions, Happy New Year to you. With voices of gladness and hearts full of cheer, we wish you a happy new year.
So I said I did interview one person who'd actually been out with the singers from before the Second World War, and they stopped during the Second World War and then reformed with late teenagers, early 20s after the war. And no one told this chap who'd sung with them before the war that they'd actually started again. And when I went to visit him, he was really quite upset when I told him that they'd actually reformed. So I don't know what he'd done wrong to not that they hadn't let him know. Anyway, he gave me sort of a typical route from before the Second World War, and it starts off down at the bottom. In those days, they didn't have a watch night service. And they used to wait for the blowers to go off at midnight in Wigan. Now, for those of you who are old enough to remember, lots of factories and mines and mills used to have a hooter or a blower that would sound for the shift changes. And apparently the tradition in Wigan and presumably elsewhere was on New Year's Eve at midnight they would all sound together. So they'd wait for the blowers to go off, and then they'd set off on their trek, calling in at various houses en route, and they'd work their way up the right hand side of this into Roby Mill, which is where the two little routes join there, up to top end there, which is a place called Ayersfield, it's a farm, back into Roby Mill where they'd have a breakfast, then over to the west, over to this place called Elmer's Green, which is now part of Skem Newtown, but in those days was a colliery village. And then they used to go up to a place called Asher's Beacon. Now he said over the beacon, but there'd be no point in going over the top, so I think he must have meant the pub at the bottom, which had the same name, and there were houses there. Then they used to walk all the way back down Mill Lane, down to the bottom, and out to Holland Moor to the west, which is also now a part of the new town, and then back for a big breakfast at 7 or 8 in the morning at Beach House Aunt Polly's. And I've measured that, and it's about 8 or 9 miles, depending what route you actually take. And at some point in the 1960s, a recording was made of them singing in the hallway of a house in the early hours of the morning. And it was made on an old reel-to-reel tape recorder, and isn't of particularly good quality. The recording I've got on it has been transferred many times. But as far as I know, this is the only recording that was ever made by the singers. And the tune that was recorded is called Brocco Bank. Now, as I mentioned, Eunice Halliwell, who was the first person who gave me any information about the carol singers, she was so fond of the tune Brocco Bank, she named her bungalow after it. So I'll play this at the end, but I'm sure anyone familiar with Sheffield will know the road with the same name there. And all the singers I met look back to the all-night singing with very fond memories. They'd be left keys to the houses just to let themselves in when they got there and sing up the stairs to the people in bed. They'd be left drinks and mince pies to help themselves to, and of course all Methodists. But one story that did get told me was when they turned up at a house at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the daughters of the house were sitting on the steps shivering because it was a cold night, and they weren't wearing much because they'd been out night clubbing. So I think this must be the 1960s, 70s. And Wigan was famous for its nightclub scene, and they'd gone back to home, and the parents wouldn't allow the daughters to come back into the house until the carol singers had been in and let in the new year. As I said, the tradition stopped during the Second World War, but it appears what happened afterwards, what happened before, were very similar. In the early days, they used to walk the route. Latter days, they would use a charabanc. And as I said before, at the same time the Roby Mill singers were going from house to house, so were the carol singers from Digmore Methodist Church in Skelmersdale, or what is now Skelmersdale. And apparently sometimes they would actually have a joint service, watch night service after the Second World War. And as I said, the carol singers were a mixed group, but I had great difficulty getting to interview any of them. They didn't want to know. But the Roby Mill singers were really happy to talk, and they wanted to tell me about it. And the Digmore singers really clammed up. They just didn't want to remember it for some reason. But the one lady I did manage to speak to, she'd sung with them in the 1950s when she was a late teenager into her early 20s, and she only remembered them singing A Charge to Keep I Have. But then they sang Come Welcome the New Year, and they had another another New Year carol, A Happy New Year to you all assembled here tonight. And I've not managed to find that anywhere else, but it's a printed copy, so it must exist in some collection. And again, they take odd requests for carols. And the Digmore route also used to include Holland Moor, and apparently sometime the two groups were singing quite close together. And apparently occasionally they did meet. And I used to think it was unusual for through the night carol singing on New Year's Eve rather than Christmas Eve. However, now it's much easier to access old newspapers online. I've realised there are many reports in the late 1800s of both churches and individual singers going round during the night, especially in East Lancashire, around Burnley and Blackburn, but also in other parts of the country, other parts of the county and elsewhere in the country. So presumably the Roby Mill carol singing tradition was a remnant of that. For instance, in Bolton in 1865, numerous carol parties paraded the streets during the night, and in Darwin near Blackburn in 1892, and during the early morning of the new year, bands of carol singers went from house to house in all parts of the town, filling the air with sweet harmonies which made the early morning enjoyable. And then there's rather a wonderful report from the Wigan Observer in March 1881 about a court case. All the best reports always come from court cases. The Farmer and the Carol Singers. At the Wigan County Court on Wednesday, Thomas Ashhole Collier, Rainford, brought an action against John Dean Farmer up Holland to recover the sum of £3 13 shillings and sixpence for injuries sustained by an assault. Mr. Lees appeared for the plaintiff. In opening the case, he said, "On the 1st of January last, the defendant committed on the plaintiff what appeared to be an unjustifiable, unprovoked and ungentlemanly assault. About 2 o'clock on New Year's morning, the plaintiff and 6 other men went to the defendant's house carol singing. They went to the back door and had been singing about 5 minutes when the defendant came out with a thick towel rail and struck plaintiff on the head with it. The blow felled him to the floor, and while the plaintiff was on the floor, the defendant commenced kicking him in the ribs. He also called for his brothers, and they likewise kicked the plaintiff in the ribs. After they had finished kicking him, they carried him some 20 or 30 yards and placed him on some stones. His companions, who had run away, returned, and they carried him home, where he was put to bed and remained for 5 days. At the end of that time, plaintiff went to see Dr. Twyford in St. Helens, and he was treated by him and was unable to follow his work 3 weeks. Plaintiff claimed 15 shillings, the charge made by Dr. Twyford, 4 shillings for rail fare to St. Helens, and 9 days' wages at 6 shillings a day, £2 14 shillings. The colliery at which the plaintiff worked employed the men for the first 9 days in January, and but for the injury, the plaintiff would have worked the 9 days out of the 3 weeks he was laid up. And the article's quite long. It goes into a lot more detail, but the outcome was he won the case and got his costs as well. So, just to finish, I'd like to play you the only recording I know of the Roby Mill Carol Singers, recorded, as I say, in the early hours of the morning when they didn't know they were being recorded. And this is the tune Brocco Bank.
Come, let us join our cheerful song, when they around the throne, 10,000 thousand but all the joy
that's it. Hope it was interesting.
That certainly was. Thank you, Peter. That was really good. Thank you. Fascinating stuff. How many? In the newspaper report, I think it said there were 6 carol singers. How many were in your average?
That I don't know. I mean, they varied a lot over the years. Yes, I don't actually know how many. I mean, say that eventually they had to give up because they just didn't have enough.
Right.
But yeah, no, I don't know what the maximum number was. Hard to tell from that recording, really.
It's more than 6. You can imagine people singing up your stairs at 2 o'clock in the morning. If there's a dozen of them or something, that would be a bit scary, wouldn't it? Anybody got any comments or questions? I'm surprised that Ian. Oh, hold on. Katie's waving, I think. Are you waving, Katie, or just? Yep. Unmute.
Sorry, I've lost how to put my hand up.
Right.
Technologically, I had to do it in real time, as it were. That's fascinating, Peter. Really interesting. I was just looking at the scores that you presented there. I noticed that a lot of them were in flats, looked like E flat to me. And I was just wondering whether that is usual in these sorts of songs, or whether it might have represented brass band accompaniment at some point, something like that.
No, but I found it quite interesting. I think it's yes, it will be E flat. All the versions of "Come Welcome the New Year." I'm not sure about Ian Russell's one, but all the ones I've got, including from America right through to the person who was collected in Staffordshire, yeah, they're all in the same key. But I wouldn't have thought if it was E flat in America, I wouldn't have thought that would have a brass band influence particularly. Yeah, but E flat's a good key for singing in. When we used to sing together as a foursome, we nearly always ended up in flat keys.
Oh, I wouldn't have known that, but I just wondered, with it being another area, an area with that tradition as well, whether there might have been some accompaniment at some point, but we can't tell from what you're saying now.
Ian's got his hand up. You need to unmute, Ian.
Thank you, Steve. I don't think E flat means it's a brass key, by the way, Katie, because in a concert pitch that would be E flat would be C sharp, so I don't think that would work. No, Peter, before Jehovah's Awful Throne, I do have a version now from Lodge Moor, which is part of Sheffield these days.
Excellent.
And it's I kind of feel that there is a family well, I know there are family connections between Lytton and Lodge Moor, and this particular version comes from someone who kept the Three Merry Lads pub, whose name was Fred Marsden. And Fred played the fiddle, and he led the carolling in the Three Merry Lads. And his grandson sent me a copy of his manuscript, and it's fascinating. It's got quite a number of bits and pieces that don't crop up anywhere else. So, yeah, Lodge Moor, don't sing before Jehovah's Awful Throne.
About time they did again, isn't it?
But who knows?
Did they still call the tune Conquest there?
No. In fact, they called it before Jehovah's Awful Throne.
Right, okay.
That's all it says in the manuscript, and it has the words. It doesn't just have the tune.
Thank you. John Baxter's got his hand up. Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was really interesting. I know the Sheffield and Derbyshire carols tend to be associated with pubs, but the singing you were talking about seemed to be associated with primitive Methodists. Was there a temperance element to, were any of these involved in the Bands of Hope and things like that? That was a big movement in the late 19th century in the newspaper articles you looked at.
I think, well, the people who responded to me with individual carols which from their own churches were very much, there's quite a strong movement of independent Methodism in that area of Lancashire. And they often seem to be in those sorts of churches. Now, whether that goes over to temperance, I'm not sure. You'd have thought probably the case, yes. But as I say, the other place with like school teachers keeping them going for their particular places they worked, so this is where the schools were. But yeah, so I haven't really picked up a temperance one per se, but independent Methodism definitely seemed to keep the words going. And there's one of the carols I got from the Independent Methodists near Wigan. They sing over in Ring On, which Ian will know as being sung Thorpe Hesley, Ecclesfield, and I think there's a Methodist, I might be wrong here, but I think there's a Methodist connection there, isn't there, Ian? He's not.
I've recorded that carol in Meltham as well, near Huddersfield.
Well, is there any Methodist connection there?
Yeah, the Methodists sing it, there's no question.
Yeah.
It's also sung in the Church of England and by groups that aren't connected.
Can I show my ignorance by saying is independent Methodism particularly different to non-independent Methodism?
They're not connected with any of the three main strands of Methodism. There was the Prims, the
United.
Alison's correcting me here. The Primitives, the United, and the Wesleyans. But they're not. They were the three main strands of Methodism. The Independents had nothing to do with them.
Okay.
Yeah. In Worrell, Steve and Peter, the home of many of the manuscripts that I have, it was an independent Methodist chapel that kept the carols going in chapel certainly into the 1960s and possibly the early 70s.
Right. No more questions, and we've done very well keeping to time today. So thank you again, Peter. That was absolutely fascinating. And now Steve is going to take us back to the war, I think. You've got to unmute.
Yeah,
Steve.
okay. Have you got me?
Yes, we have.
All right, okay, right. Well, into war and the Second World War, following on from episode 5. Before I move on to episode 6, I've got an addendum which Steve involves Steve from the episode 5, actually. If you remember, we were talking and we were playing, or I was singing the Jolly Ploughboy or the Scarlet and the Blue, and doing my annual request for anyone to find out any origins for it. And and Steve made an excellent response there by looking at the newspaper archives and online newspaper archives, and came up with a couple really of two really useful pieces of information. First of all, we have what we think, well, I think anyway, is the proper title for the song, which is Hurrah for the Scarlet and the Blue, which is the first line of the chorus, Hurrah for the Scarlet and the Blue. So we have a title which we can follow up now, a proper title. And also we have a new earliest date for it as well, because I think Steve found 4 entries for it. What happened in the newspapers, as some of you will know, in the 19th century and indeed later in the newspapers, was local newspapers used to broadcast any events that had taken place, like a concert of some sort, and in that report would be a whole list of who sang what song. And that's what these reports are, all 4 of them. The earliest one then is December 1888. And that's at the Walthamstow Conservative Club, a smoking concert. And the other reports are another smoking concert in 1903 in the Cowley Barracks in Oxford, which might be significant, and the other 2 in 1907 and 1908 at military gatherings. So what I'm doing here is I'm offering a prize. Wow. A copy of any one of our, which will be 6 books coming up shortly, in the Marrowbones series. I'm offering a free copy of any one of the 6 books to anybody who can find the original sheet music or at least the origin of it. So there's that. So that's an add over from episode 5. Now episode 6. Before I go into that, I'd just like to remind you that these traditional song forum Zoom meetings are now able to include lots of people from all over the world giving presentations, which is absolutely fantastic. And one of the things that's brought out, to me at least, is there are still ongoing communities where traditional songs are still being made, local songs, which are not necessarily part of what we call the Anglo speaking world of folk songs that are spread out, that, you know, got versions spread out all over the Anglo speaking world. They're specific to a local area and they're still carrying on. For instance, one of the excellent ones is the hunting one. The girl who did the hunting presentation, hunting songs, and that's still going on. They're still making songs. That tradition is still, it's not a revival, it's something that's still going on. So you might be also pleased to know that this is also happening in the forces, certainly in the UK, and I would suggest probably in everywhere practically. In the forces, they are often being moved around to different places around the world, and they make their own songs and they continue with their own songs, and that is still going on today. And how I came across that was some of the songs I'm going to be talking about today and singing today. I was going online to try and find out more information about their background and came across more versions. Songs that were written in the 1920s and the 1930s are still being sung in the forces today. And if you can find the forums, the United Services Forum, I think one of them is, and they're still passing these songs around and still singing them. So when they're posted abroad to, say, India or wherever, they'll have meetings and they'll still have little sing-arounds and things and still be singing these songs and certainly passing them around amongst each other. So we'll move on then to episode 6. The last episode I recorded a chap from the singing songs from the First World War, Ted Kirk, who was a teacher in the school I was teaching in, and that was in the 70s. In the 80s, I was moved to what was the upper school, where the older children were, and I came across another teacher who was a history teacher, who was in his 50s then, and he had been from 1946 to 1948, he had been an intelligence officer. He'd done his degree during the war, I presume, and then when he joined up just as the war ended, and he had to go around all the people who were waiting to be demobilized and sent back to this country, and not everybody could be sent back to Britain and repatriated at the same time. And it was gathering intelligence for the army on what had gone on during the war, what had succeeded, what had failed, you know, all that type of stuff. And as he was doing that, he was going along to the sods operas that were still going on then, as they were during the war, in all these different places around the world, North Africa, India, Europe, Germany, and picking up their songs that they were still singing in the sods operas. And he had a really, really good memory. And some of these songs actually went back to the 1930s. And were still obviously being sung during the war and still today. So we'll go to the first one. Can I apologise, first of all, that we haven't got the actual songs on the screen here. I do promise that by the next episode, if I get that far, I will try and do some screen sharing. I shall have a go at practicing that. But hopefully you've got copies that Martin sent copies. So we'll move on to what George's repertoire. Before we do that, I'd just like to say that these songs are in collections and they're very much available. Some of you will know about this already. There are quite a sizable number of books that you can get hold of that that give lots of versions of these songs from the forces. There's one called the Fleet Air Arm Songbook, There's the Airman Songbook by Ward Jackson and Leighton Lucas. Some of them obviously are going to be a bit raunchy, and then we get bawdy ballads and dirty ditties of the wartime RAF. I can put a list, if anyone's interested, I can put a list of these up on the traditional song forum on the Trad Song website. Obviously, you'll all be aware of Roy Palmer's great book, the What a Lovely War. One of my mum's songs is actually in there. And then we get the other bawdy ones, obviously, like bawdy barrack room ballads, For God's Sake, Don't Take Me, and Songs and Barrel, Kiss Me Goodnight, Sergeant Major, Martin Page's 2 books. Those are all British ones. I also have several American ones as well, so you do get the American equivalents as well. One called GI Songs by Palmer, not Roy Palmer, another Palmer. I've got here Air Force, what's that one called? Air Force Airs by Walrich. That's full of the same type of stuff. And then there's the old big one that only comes up to World War II, which is Sound Off Soldiers songs, the great big one. So there are lots of these songs are available online as well as in books as well. Right, so that's that. Right, well, George Collinson himself then, he had a job interviewing forces personnel, trying to get this information from them. Amongst his repertoire of 29 songs, by the way, all of these songs, I'm going to be singing some of them, but some of these songs, well, all of these songs, 29 of them can be accessed on the British Library Sound Archive under the World Traditional Music section, which I'm sure you're all aware of anyway, under the Europe section. And then if you put my name in, or George Collinson's name, that's the name of the chap who I'm talking about, George Collinson, you will get all 29 of those recordings. Right, now the songs are pretty much a mixed bag. One of the songs, one of the nicest songs that he sang me was from his own grandmother in Derbyshire, which I might get round to singing, depends how the time goes. Some of the other songs that he sang for me, which I won't be using today, are the songs from his student days, which would have been during the war, things like Cockayne Sue, that type of stuff. The Foggy Dew, that one. But the majority of the songs he sang were these songs that he collected during the war, or just after the war. He sang a version of 7 Nights Drunk that he'd picked up. It's pretty much similar to other versions. That's not one I'm going to include. He also sang a version of the Lobster Song, which is one of the cruder versions and wouldn't be suitable here, so I'm not going to sing that. But the first one I'm going to have a go at, or some of it anyway, is a song called The Somersetshire, which is actually a medley of tunes. Those of you, you'll all be familiar with medleys, that are very common, right, going back to at least the 18th century, just a sort of list of different verses to different tunes that are well-known tunes. And this is what happens with this one. It actually dates back to the 1930s. The Somersetshire was a ship that was built from the Bibby line, was built in 1921, and it was converted to a troop ship in 1927. And this tells of our airmen, Air Force men, being transferred from Sudan, from Khartoum in Sudan. That's what the song is basically about. So I'm not going to sing the first verse simply because I don't really know the tune. A lot of the tunes are well-known tunes, so I'm going to recite it. We've been asked to sort of try and give the full songs wherever we can because for various reasons. So I'm going to recite bits and sing bits. So those who've got the sheet there, this is it. There's a home for tired airmen way down in the sunny Sudan, where all the Airks are batchy and so is the blinking old man. Airks are simply short for aircraftsmen, batchy crazy. There's bags and bags of bull saluting on the square, And when we're not saluting, we're up in the blinking air. For we're leaving Khartoum by the light of the moon, and we're sailing by night and by day. We've passed Casfarit and we've nothing to eat, 'cause we've thrown all our rations away. Oh, the Shire, the Somersetshire, the skipper looks on her with pride, and he'd have a blue fit if he saw any dirt on the side of the Somersetshire. This is my story, this is my song. I've been in this works too blinking long. So roll on the Nelson, the rod renown. We can't flog the hood 'cause the blinking thing's down. Ashenay, what to say? Oh, the chorus is grand, I could sing it all day. And of course, the Nelson, the Rodney, and the Renown are famous battleships, and the hood sank, of course, as we all know. Some of the tune there, obviously, Villikins. That Leaving Khartoum by the Light of the Moon bit sounds a bit like Abdullah Bulbul the Mere tune to me by Percy French. Maybe, maybe not. The next one is yeah, let's just have a look quick. Oh yeah, George then sang a 3-stanza song to the tune of Mary Lloyd's A Little Bit of What You Fancy Does You Good, called Saida Bint. It was sung in Egypt and the Gulf states in World War II, but is extremely racist and sexist, so I'm not going to sing that one. And it reminds me of the 1 or 2 ditches. My dad served in Burma, and then he also served in North Africa, and he was in Egypt, and the only bits of ditches that he knew were also about Queen Farida and one about King Farouk. And again, they were very racist songs, so I'm not going to go into those. But the Shaiba Blues, I will have an attempt at it. I'll only get the tune approximately. But as I say, you can go to the website and hear it being sung. It goes to A Little Bit of Heaven. So use your imagination if you don't already know that tune. I'll have a go at it. Oh, a little bit of heaven fell from out the sky one day, and it landed in the Bundu, not so very far away. And when the Air Force saw it, oh, it looked so grim and bare. They said, that's what we're looking for, we'll build an airworks there. So they sent out river gunboats, armored cars and SHQs. La 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 la. I've got the Shaiba Blues. Now, Peachy, I am waiting for that day that's far remote. Until that day, you'll hear me say, roll on that blinking boat. I've got those Shaiba Blues, Shaiba Blues, cheesed off and far from home. And he says, George says that's got lots more verses, but he didn't know. The Bundu, as it's is Hindi for the desert wilderness, and Peachy is soon. And the whole song about Shaiba is it was an RAF base on the Gulf of Aden, and very the airmen were very disparaging about it. So they made up that sarcastic song. Right. George then sang a full version of the Corps of Royal Engineers song, which came originally from the South African Wars. Again, that's rather racist, so I'm not going to sing that one. And then he sang a version of The Dying Aviator, which, well, in some versions is a parody of the Tarpaulin Jacket song. And there are lots and lots of parodies on this, the dying cowboy, the dying other occupations and things. There are lots of different parodies that go with it. This one was sung by the Royal Flying Corps in the First World War and continued by the RAF through the 20s and 30s. The tune that I'd heard before more commonly is more like the Tarpaulin Jacket, but see what you think of this is how George sang it. Oh, a poor aviator lay dying at the end of a long summer day. All his comrades were gathered around him to carry the fragments away. Take the sparking plug from my elbow, take the butterfly bolt from my brain, extract from my liver the crankshaft and assemble the engine again. And the whole song goes through all the parts of the engine that are embedded in his body and finishes that last verse on, there's a lot of good parts in me yet. And those people who would like to get the full versions of that, there are several versions in some of those books that I've shown you. And the very last verse goes, so fill up your glasses steady. This world is a world full of lies. Here's a health to the men dead already, and a health to the next man to die. Certainly the first two lines of each verse, the tune there reminds me of the old hunting song, Bellman. Let's say farewell to old Bellman in that particular version. And then another song that George sang was, again, this is related very, very closely to a traditional song. It's Round 516. The tune he used is pretty much like the next song that's going to come up. And this is how it went. Oh, this old coat of mine, the inside is quite new. The outside has seen some very fine weather. So I throw this coat of mine to the ocean wild and wide. Roll on the boat that takes me home. And then it just, like a catalogue song, it just goes through coat, shirt, shoes, pants. And of course, it's related to the Navvy Boots song, the Kettle Smock, or the Bold English Navvy is my master title for those. So that song was actually used as a striptease in the Sods operas. They used to actually take off the coat and throw it to one side, take off and strip off completely as part of the entertainment in the Sods operas. You had to be there. Right, then George sang us Baby Lie Easy, which some of you may know from his student days. He sang a fragment of Macafee, which I'll come to maybe in the next episode. Died of Love, he sang a version of Died of Love, which we've had before from My Family Songs in a previous episode. And he also sang a song called Sari Marae, which is a South African song, which was top of the war, top of the pops during the war. But this Maggie May version here, which of course the tune is based on Darling Nellie Ray from 1854. He actually picked this one up from a lad in the King's Liverpool Regiment who he was instructing in battle. The way he sings it, if you listen to it on the British Library archive, he sings it. He starts off with the regular proper tune, but all the way through all the other verses, it's the B part of it. He uses the B part of the tune as well in the A part and the B part. But I'll see if I can sing it with the A and the B part for each verse. Now gather round, you sailor boys, and listen to my plea. And when you hear my story, pity me. For I was a goddamn fool in the port of Liverpool, the first time that I came home from sea. I was strolling through the town and feeling rather down. £2.10 a month was all my pay. With a whiskey and a gin, I was very soon taken in by a girl by the name of Maggie May. Oh, the first time that I met her, I really went to get her. She was cruising up and down Old Cannon Place with a hip line so divine. She went to the heart of mine, and being a sailor, I gave chase. Next morning I awoke to find that I was broke. No clothes, no jacket could I find. So I looked at Maggie May, and she turned round to say, they're down at Stanley's pawn shop number 9. To the pawn shop I did go, I wasn't very slow. The coppers came and took that girl away. And the judge guilty found her for robbing a homeward bounder, and he paid her passage back to Botany Bay. Oh, Maggie, Maggie May, they have taken her away. No more down Lime Street will she roam. She's been kissed by all the sailors and captains of the whalers, but she'll never walk down Lime Street anymore. And I think my 20 minutes is up. So we've a couple more there, but we can always carry them over into, I've still got lots more war songs to come, so we'll carry them over into episode 7. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, as always. Very entertaining. Are they all parodies? I mean, apart from the traditional ones.
Well, they use not all parodies. No, I mean Maggie May obviously uses the Darling Nelly Ray tune, but doesn't use any of the text or the sentiment, so it's not really a parody. But quite a lot of them are parodies. Yeah.
Any questions from anybody? Any questions or comments? No. Lordy me, we're 5 minutes ahead. This has never been known before.
Do you want me to carry on a bit?
Why not?
Katie's got a question.
Katie's got a question again.
Okay.
You've got to teach Katie how to hold up her hand.
Yeah, I seem to have changed it since the last time I used Zoom. I can't find it anywhere. It's just a comment, and I was just going to look it up. I haven't had time to check it, but I think, Steve, that Jeff Ling from Blackthall used to sing Maggie May, and the way you described your singer as singing it, just singing the B part as the tune for the second third verse. I think he sang it the same way.
Yeah, George must have known the full tune because he starts it off with the A part, but just all the rest is using the B part. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the same way that Jeff sang it. I haven't had time to check it, but perhaps it was more widely spread, not just him.
Very, very possibly, yes. Yeah.
So, thank you, Katie. Ian's got his hand up now.
I think there's a whole area of research here that Steve has touched on. Songs from the armed forces are certainly a significant element, but there's also other groups besides huntsmen and people who follow the hunt who have songs connected with their occupation. I have in my possession a collection of songs from climbing. From the climbing fraternity, and this was made by a friend of mine who went climbing, and all his life he noted down songs connected with that occupation, that pastime of climbing, and there is a version of The Poor Mountaineer Lay Dying. There is a version of that, for example. So there are lots of parallels.
Yeah, I've got a sort of cyclist-styled songbook for the Edinburgh Climbing Club, or whatever they were called, from the 50s, I think. Similar kind of repertoire, yeah.
I would imagine as there are probably some links there with the Ramblers as well, because the Ramblers also, a rambling club, going back to the 1920s and even earlier, had their own songbooks and songs of their own occupation. You know, so Ilkley Mo Bartat, I think, came out of that sort of realm.
Yeah, the Clarion Ramblers in Sheffield are a famous example of a group that had their own songbook. Yeah.
That's great. Any more questions? The raising your hand is in reactions now, if I remember rightly, down the bottom there.
Yeah.
If anybody's challenged. Anyway, thank you again to our three speakers. Every time I say this, you know, there's wonderful range of things we get for our meetings, and that's what makes them so interesting. So thanks again to our speakers. Thanks everybody for coming. We'll see you, I hope, on the 27th of November for our special one, and the 11th of December for our Christmas do. Did somebody want to say, Martin?
Yeah. Could I just say that for this next special meeting, the arrangements for sending the link out may be a bit different. I may close off booking a couple of days early, because that week is a little bit hectic for us because we're out of the country for most of it, and then headed up to Cambridgeshire at the end of the week, And the meeting itself could be quite interesting because it'll be presented from one location. So
all in my
that's how we're going to make that work. So we'll see you then, and then it's back to normal afterwards. With yeah, this time I had to close, get the links out early. Doesn't seem to have we haven't had anyone who signed in the last 24 hours, so that wasn't a problem. But always remember, it's great if you can sign in early, rather than leaving it to the last minute, and even if better if you don't forget altogether. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Cheerio.
Bye now.
Bye. Bye.